Buckinghamshire, England, late 19th century. On a hill that had no business holding anything this grand, a palace appears. Not a manor house, not a gentleman's retreat, a chateau. Full French Renaissance, towers and slate and carved stone dormers. The kind of thing Loire Valley nobles built when they needed to remind a king of their power. Except this one belongs to no king, no duke, no ancient English family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. It belongs to a banker. This is Waddesdon Manor. And from the moment the first stone was laid, it was never simply a home. It was a statement, a performance, a three-dimensional argument about who deserves to exist at the center of power and what it costs to put that argument in writing. Stand in the entrance hall today. Look up. Gilded ceilings catch the afternoon light. Crystal chandeliers hang over Renaissance portraits, and Sèvres porcelain arranged behind velvet ropes. Visitors move slowly, phones raised, voices low. Tour guides speak in the careful, reverent tones reserved for cathedrals and burial sites. The air carries furniture polish and old silk, and the faint, particular gravity of rooms that have witnessed things they were never meant to reveal. This is the story Waddesdon wants you to see. Impeccable, serene, the natural expression of extraordinary taste. Now walk that same hall backward through time. November 1940. The chandeliers are dark. Blackout curtains smother every window. Tape runs across the glass in crude X patterns, not decoration, but armor, a crude shield against the pressure wave of a bomb. Outside, searchlights drag slow arcs across the Buckinghamshire sky. Inside, the grand rooms are cold and empty. The portraits watch over nothing. The family is gone. The staff, reduced to whoever remained after the enlistments, stripped the house down to bone. And in the basement strong rooms, packed in crates, wrapped in blankets, sealed against damp, paintings from the National Gallery wait out the Blitz in silence. Rembrandt, Gainsborough. Works the British government trusted to these walls when London itself felt too fragile to hold them. The same rooms where a baron once poured brandy for the Prince of Wales now function as a vault for a nation's cultural survival. Same house. Two entirely different worlds. And the distance between them tells you everything. Because Waddesdon was never built for permanence. It was built against fear. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild broke ground here in 1874. 15 years and an almost incomprehensible amount of money later, the last stone was set. What emerged from that hillside was not simply a country estate. It was a counter-argument to centuries of exclusion. A family that had been banned from owning land across much of Europe, not for any crime, but for the faith they were born into, had raised something that made the English aristocracy's oldest houses look, by comparison, merely comfortable. The Rothschilds built Waddesdon to prove they had arrived, that they belonged, that their wealth had purchased not only luxury, but something rarer and more fragile: safety, legitimacy, a future with their name on it. They were wrong about the safety part. They would spend the next century learning exactly how wrong. This is not a story about a beautiful house. Beautiful houses are easy. This is a story about what beauty gets used for, how it becomes currency, armor, theater, and finally, evidence. It is a story about the price of belonging when belonging is never freely given. About the servants who made elegance look effortless while their own lives remained entirely invisible. About a family that controlled the finances of nations and still could not fully control how the world saw them. About old money. Not the fairy tale, gilded and uncomplicated, but the actual thing, morally tangled, relentlessly strategic, built on systems that rewarded some people and quietly erased everyone else. The chandeliers at Waddesdon still shine. The gardens are still immaculate. The porcelain still gleams behind its ropes. But if you know where to look, if you press close enough to the tall French windows and let your eyes adjust, You can still trace the ghost of tape marks on the glass. The house survived. The world it was built for did not. And that gap, between what Waddesdon was meant to be and what history made of it, is where the real story lives. Paris, 1839. The boy was not supposed to live. Ferdinand James Anselm de Rothschild entered the world pale, thin, and constitutionally fragile, the kind of child whose existence becomes a quiet household emergency. Private doctors, expensive tonics, whispered consultations in corridors while the child slept fitfully in another room. His father, Anselm, ran the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt and Vienna. One uncle held Paris, another controlled London. The family enterprise stretched across 5 capitals, moving gold and government bonds through a nervous system built from blood ties and encrypted correspondence. It was the most powerful private financial network in the world, and it ran on strength, confidence, and the particular ruthlessness of men who never doubted their right to be in the room. Ferdinand's brothers were built for that world. Ferdinand was not. He was kept apart, protected. The fragile one, watched over while his brothers were groomed for dinners with ministers and briefings on which government owed what to which branch of the family. There is a specific education that comes from growing up weak inside a dynasty built entirely on power. It teaches you that your worth is conditional, that you are always one bad season away from being quietly sidelined, that you must find ways to prove yourself that your stronger brothers will never have to imagine. And it teaches you one more thing, the thing that would eventually reshape a hilltop in Buckinghamshire. When the world outside feels genuinely dangerous, you learn to build worlds you can control. Ferdinand was sent to England in his teens. The damp English climate, someone decided, would be kinder to his lungs than the hard continental winters. An odd prescription, perhaps. But families operating from fear will believe whatever gives them hope. He arrived shy, foreign, his English uncertain, his place in the family's great machine still undefined. He was an heir to one of the largest fortunes in European history, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do with his life. Then he fell in love. Her name was Evelina, his cousin. The Rothschilds married within the family deliberately. It kept the banking network tight, inheritances concentrated, and secrets sealed inside the clan. But what existed between Ferdinand and Evelina was more than a calculated alliance. Surviving letters suggest something genuine. Private jokes, shared anxieties, the small, tender architecture of 2 people actually building a life together. She was 18, he was 26. They married in 1865. 18 months later, she was dead. The child died with her. The historical record goes nearly silent at this point. Victorian men of Ferdinand's class and position did not write openly about grief. Rothschild men especially were expected to absorb catastrophe without visible fracture, to steady empires and entertain royalty and never let the mask slip in public. So Ferdinand left no confessional diary, no dramatic letters, cataloguing the depth of his loss. His choices said everything instead. He stepped back from the family bank. He loosened his ties to Vienna and Frankfurt, to the financial machinery his brothers moved through with ease. He settled permanently in England, and he began to collect, obsessively, relentlessly, with the focused intensity of a man who had discovered the only activity that gave him genuine relief. Porcelain, paintings, furniture, manuscripts, objects he could catalogue and arrange and control, objects that occupied precise positions and stayed exactly where he placed them, objects that would never leave. By his early 30s, the collection had outgrown every wall he had. His London house was overflowing, rooms converted to storage, staircases narrowed by crates, every surface claimed. But a collection of that magnitude doesn't just need space, it needs a stage. It needs architecture that tells visitors, before a single object is even glimpsed, that what they are about to see is important, that the man who assembled it matters. It needs, in short, a castle. The decision to build crystallized in the early 1870s. Ferdinand would later describe it in measured terms: a seat in the country worthy of his name and position. Polite phrasing. The psychology underneath was considerably sharper. He was going to build something so flawless, so culturally authoritative, so undeniably magnificent that the English aristocracy, which still regarded the Rothschilds as foreign upstarts, Jewish, continental, too rich, too fast, would have no choice but to acknowledge that this banking family understood elegance as deeply as any house whose name ran back through the Domesday Book. He was building a monument to control, because his entire life had been a lesson in how little could truly be controlled. The wound that drove Ferdinand never showed in photographs. No visible scar, no dramatic origin story. Just a quiet, persistent damage, shaped by childhood illness, by the conditional nature of his place in the family, by the sudden, total loss of the only person he had chosen freely. That wound guided every decision that followed. The French Renaissance style, chosen deliberately over English convention. The boldly impractical hilltop site. The obsessive insistence on perfection in every room, every garden bed, every dinner course. The famous weekend parties that would eventually draw the Prince of Wales himself to smoke cigars in Ferdinand's library and sleep in Ferdinand's guest rooms. Look, the house was meant to say. Look at what I have made. Look at what I deserve. Look how completely I belong. But belonging purchased through architecture is never fully secure. And somewhere beneath the performance, beneath the gilded ceilings and the precisely curated guest lists, lived a truth Ferdinand could never quite bring himself to say aloud. That no matter how flawless the facade, the ground beneath it had never been guaranteed. Not for a Rothschild, not in the 19th century, not in any century that had come before. He knew this. He built anyway. The hill in Buckinghamshire was waiting. Buckinghamshire, 1874. The hill was the first problem. It would not be the last. Ferdinand purchased roughly 2,700 acres of Buckinghamshire countryside that year. Rolling fields, ancient hedgerows, the quiet pastoral geometry of rural England. And at the centre of it all, a bare, windswept hilltop that no architect of sound judgment would have selected for a construction project of any serious ambition. The exposure was brutal. The logistics were worse. Everything, stone, timber, brick, beam, thousands upon thousands of tons of raw material, would have to be dragged upward against gravity, on roads that did not yet exist, to a summit that offered nothing but a commanding view and an owner's absolute refusal to be talked out of it. The locals thought he was mad. The nearest railway station sat miles away. The village of Waddesdon was small and entirely unprepared for what was about to arrive. When Ferdinand's agents began placing orders, not modest orders, but orders of a scale that strained regional suppliers, and when the hiring of labourers started pulling men from surrounding towns, the true dimension of the plan became impossible to dismiss. This was not a country house. It was an engineering campaign wearing the costume of architecture. Ferdinand hired a French architect, Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, and the choice was not incidental. He wanted nothing that resembled a traditional English estate. No Georgian restraint, no calm Palladian symmetry, no polite understatement signaling that wealth here needed no announcement. He wanted a Loire Valley chateau, the kind French nobles commissioned in the 16th century when they needed to make an argument to their king in stone. Soaring towers, elaborate dormers, facades carved with the obsessive detail of people who understood that grandeur, to be believed, must be earned in every inch. The irony was not lost on anyone. A Jewish banker from Frankfurt, hiring a French architect to build a French palace on English soil, in order to impress an English aristocracy that still regarded his family as foreign upstarts. But Ferdinand understood the grammar of symbols more acutely than most. If you cannot be born into old European elegance, you acquire its blueprints. You hire its craftsmen. You reassemble it, stone by stone, on ground you have purchased outright, and you make it undeniable. The serious work began in 1877. First, the hill itself had to be remade. The bare summit was excavated, leveled, and restructured from the ground up. Steam engines were hauled to the site to power the digging. Workers drove down to bedrock in critical sections, then raised massive retaining walls to hold the reshaped terrain against its own weight. The land was not simply built upon. It was conquered. Then came the approach. Ferdinand commissioned a winding drive that climbed the hill in long, deliberate curves, designed so that the house revealed itself in stages. A tower here, a roofline there, the full facade withheld until the final turn delivered it all at once. The road was theatre. Every foot of the ascent was calibrated to build anticipation. Visitors were meant to arrive slightly breathless, already softened, already impressed. It worked. It still does. The house rose slowly and at enormous expense. Bath stone for the facades, pale and precise, Welsh slate for the roof lines. Ornamental carvings executed by craftsmen brought over specifically from France, because English hands, however skilled, were not trained in this particular vocabulary of excess. A central tower, wings extending east and west, dozens of tall, multi-paned windows flooding the interiors with light in a way most English country houses, built for permanence rather than spectacle, had never bothered to attempt. But the house had another architecture entirely, one the guests were never meant to see. Beneath the gilded reception rooms and portrait galleries ran a hidden world, a maze of servant corridors, service stairs, kitchens, sculleries, storage vaults, and wine cellars that constituted the true operational engine of the estate. Staff entered through separate doors, moved along separate passages, used staircases that ran parallel to the main house without ever intersecting it. The planning was meticulous, routes designed so that servants could appear precisely when summoned and vanish completely when not. The whole system was engineered to make human labor look like something that simply happened, like weather, like physics, like a law of nature, rather than the exhausting, hierarchical machinery it actually was. Ferdinand employed dozens of staff from the beginning. Once the estate reached full operation, the number climbed past 100. Footmen, housemaids, cooks, grooms, gardeners, under-butlers, ladies' maids, scullery girls. Each with a defined role. Each with the unspoken understanding that the effortless world upstairs, the blazing fires, the perfectly timed courses, the spotless surfaces, depended entirely on them remaining invisible. The servants knew exactly what they were sustaining. The family understood it as well. The guests chose not to think about it at all. That was the essential bargain of old money architecture. You raised something magnificent enough to make a claim about who you were, and you built it on the backs of people who would never be permitted inside the rooms they spent their lives maintaining. By 1883, the main structure stood complete. Ferdinand moved in before the interiors were finished, unwilling, or perhaps simply unable, to wait any longer. The French palace on the English hill was no longer a vision on drafting paper. It was stone and glass and slate, visible for miles in every direction, dominating the Buckinghamshire landscape exactly as he had always imagined it would. The locals stopped calling him mad. They started calling him Baron. But the structure was only the beginning. A house without an audience is just an expensive silence. And Ferdinand was about to open the doors to the most powerful people in England and dare them, quietly, elegantly, and at considerable personal cost, to tell him he didn't belong. Waddesdon Manor, the 1880s. The house was finished. Now it had to work. Ferdinand understood something that most men of his era preferred not to say aloud. A great house is not a home, it is a production. The architecture is the set. The art collection is the costume. The staff, invisible, precise, relentless, are the stage machinery. And the only thing that gives any of it meaning is the audience. Not just any audience, the right one. He needed royalty. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, heir to the British throne, first visited Waddesdon in the 1880s. The exact date has softened in the historical record, but the meaning never has. The heir to the most powerful monarchy in the world, sleeping under a Rothschild roof, eating at a Rothschild table, smoking Rothschild cigars in a smoking room designed, among other things, precisely for moments like this. It looked like acceptance. It had the texture and temperature of acceptance. Whether it actually was acceptance, that was a question Ferdinand could never quite bring himself to answer directly. The weekend parties at Waddesdon became, quickly and deliberately, famous. Invitations were sought, compared, and quietly bragged about in the drawing rooms and club corridors of London. Guests arrived by private railway carriage at the local station, then transferred into Ferdinand's own carriages for the final ascent. The climb up the winding drive was choreographed to the last detail. Trees positioned to frame glimpses of stone and tower as the carriage rounded each curve, the chateau withholding its full facade until the final approach delivered it all at once, sudden and overwhelming against the Buckinghamshire sky. Inside, Ferdinand had studied the British aristocracy's tastes with the careful attention of a man who understood that he was being judged on every surface. Then he exceeded those tastes in every direction. Electric lighting, still a novelty in many English houses, poured warm, steady light across the reception rooms. An advanced heating system kept the building genuinely comfortable through deep winter, which older aristocratic houses, drafty and proud of it, frequently failed to manage. Hot water in every guest bedroom. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. This was not merely wealth on display. This was wealth that had done its homework. The weekend rhythm settled into a pattern refined over years, Friday arrivals and careful introductions, Saturday shooting parties across grounds that Ferdinand had stocked with game birds for precisely this purpose. Because English aristocrats judged a host partly by the quality of his birds, and Ferdinand had no intention of being found wanting. Afternoon tea. 12-course dinners served with a precision that made the effort behind them completely invisible. Then the traditional separation, men to the smoking room, women to the drawing room, before the party reassembled for cards, music, and conversation that stretched easily past midnight. But the evenings had a second layer that never appeared on any menu. The significant work rarely happened at the dining table. It happened in corners, in low exchanges between courses. In the library after midnight, when most guests had gone upstairs, and a small circle of men remained with brandy and the particular ease that comes from good food, a warm room, and the knowledge that no journalist was within miles. Government loans, colonial railways, concessions in territories most people could not locate on a map. Ferdinand had stepped back from daily banking operations, but he was still a Rothschild. His brothers and cousins still ran the family houses across Europe. And when ministers needed capital, when investors needed reliable intelligence about foreign markets, when a delicate arrangement required discretion, those needs did not stop at the front door of Waddesdon. They simply changed into evening clothes. Introductions were made, names exchanged, trust built, slowly and deliberately, over carefully chosen menus, and the unspoken understanding that any man capable of creating this house was connected to capital of a very serious order. The British aristocracy came. They praised the food, they marveled at the art, they expressed genuine admiration for the technology and the comfort and the sheer audacity of the whole enterprise. Then they went home and made jokes. The satirical magazine Punch ran the cartoons regularly. Rothschild figures rendered with exaggerated features, clinging to money bags, surrounded by the visual vocabulary of greed and foreign cunning. The caricatures dressed themselves as humor. They were not humor. They were a verdict, delivered repeatedly in public by a society that would accept Ferdinand's hospitality and reject his belonging in the same breath. Too rich, too fast, too Jewish, too foreign. The chateau could be as flawless as stone and money could make it. The guest list could include the heir to the throne. And still, in the eyes of a significant portion of the world Ferdinand was performing for, he remained an outsider attempting to purchase what could only be inherited. He saw the cartoons. He heard the drawing room remarks about Jewish millionaires buying their way into the landed class. He kept his reaction entirely private. Protesting would only confirm that the Barbs had found their target. So he did the only thing he believed might eventually work. He escalated. More art, more precision, more guests of greater consequence. If the house was whispered about as excessive, he made it more dazzling. If the hospitality was described as too much, he made it more exact. The logic was coldly rational, become so indispensable to the social fabric, so woven into the circuit, that the powerful traveled, that exclusion would begin to look not like a natural order, but like an embarrassing oversight. And the strategy worked, partially. The Prince of Wales kept returning. Other royals followed. Cabinet ministers, foreign diplomats, dignitaries from across Europe filled the guest rooms and shot the birds and sat at the long dinner table. Waddesdon stopped being a curiosity and became a fixture, an expected stop for anyone who moved through the upper register of British life. Yet late at night, when the last carriage lamps had disappeared down the drive and the servants were clearing the final glasses, Ferdinand walked the house alone. Past the portraits he had rescued from dispersal. Through rooms furnished with pieces that had once belonged to French royalty. Standing inside a chateau that had consumed 15 years and a fortune to raise from a bare hilltop to this. The performance had been impeccable. The audience had applauded. The social calendar confirmed his success in every measurable way. And still, beneath the applause, one question remained. The same question. Always the same. Was it enough yet? Was he finally safe? The honest answer, the one he could never fully silence, was always the same. Not yet. Not entirely. So the trains kept arriving, the rooms stayed full, the fires blazed on schedule. And Ferdinand kept performing, with absolute precision, for a world that was still quietly deciding whether it would ever fully let him in. Waddesdon Manor, 1898. Ferdinand died in December, 2 weeks before the century turned. He was 58 years old. He had never remarried after Evelina, never had children. The house he had spent 15 years building and 2 more decades refining, the chateau meant to declare permanence, to prove belonging, to secure a Rothschild future on English soil, suddenly had no one to inherit the intention behind it. The stones remained. The meaning did not transfer. This is the flaw at the heart of using architecture as proof of stability. Buildings outlive their makers, and when the maker dies without children, all those carefully placed stones become someone else's problem, someone who may not understand, or may simply not share, the wound that put them there. The inheritance moved sideways. First to Ferdinand's sister Alice, who maintained the house with competence and genuine care. Then, after her death in 1922, to her son James. Waddesdon stayed within the family, but something essential had shifted. Ferdinand had built the place as an extension of his own psychological interior, his taste, his grief, his relentless need for control, his desperate, lifelong campaign to be accepted by a world that kept accepting him conditionally and never completely. His successors inherited the masonry. They did not inherit the wound that had driven him to stack it on a hilltop in the first place. For James, Waddesdon was simply a very large, very expensive house with an extraordinary art collection and a reputation to maintain. He hosted guests. He expanded the collections. He kept the gardens immaculate and the weekends running. But the rooms were slowly becoming something Ferdinand had never intended. Stage sets for a performance whose original meaning was fading, a monument to a man rather than an argument made by one. And beyond the gates, Europe was moving in directions that made Ferdinand's dream look not just fragile, but dangerously naive. At the height of their power in the late 19th century, the Rothschilds had operated something without precedent in modern finance. 5 branches across 5 capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Naples, moving money and intelligence faster than most governments could manage either. They had financed railways across 3 continents, underwritten wars, and helped fund the British purchase of the Suez Canal. Their name had become shorthand for international finance itself, which is to say, it had become a symbol. And symbols, once fixed in the public imagination, are nearly impossible to control. Anti-Semitism had never been absent from European life, but in the decades following Ferdinand's death, it stopped being merely a social prejudice, a drawing room slight, a club door that stayed closed, and hardened into something organized, systematic, and political. Parties were built around it. Newspapers ran elaborate conspiracy theories about Rothschild control of cabinets and currency markets. A notorious forgery, the so-called protocols, circulated across the continent claiming to document a Jewish plot for global domination. The Rothschilds were named explicitly, repeatedly. Their wealth and their reach, the very qualities that had made them indispensable to governments for a century, were reframed as evidence of sinister, hidden power. From Buckinghamshire, Waddesdon looked untouchable. The English countryside felt insulated from the fever building on the continent. England was different, people told themselves, more stable, more tolerant. The Prince of Wales had visited. The family had been woven, carefully, conditionally, but genuinely woven, into the fabric of British high society. The letters arriving from relatives in Frankfurt and Vienna told a different story entirely. Restrictions on where Jewish families could live, quotas on professions, political movements with explicit mandates to dismantle Rothschild influence. In Austria and Germany, the ground beneath the family's power was beginning, slowly and then less slowly, to tilt. James de Rothschild, managing Waddesdon through the 1920s and into the 1930s, faced a contradiction he could never fully resolve. The house had been built as a monument to a rival, proof that the family had earned its place, that the performance of belonging had finally succeeded. But the world outside the gates was making that performance feel less like a triumph and more like a provocation. Every gleaming room, every flawless weekend party, every masterpiece hung in perfect light was precisely the kind of visible Jewish wealth that the rising political movements of the era had built their rhetoric around targeting. He chose preservation. The collections expanded. The gardens stayed immaculate. The weekends continued. Waddesdon remained dazzling by any measure. But the meaning of that dazzle was changing. The house no longer felt like proof of arrival. It was beginning to feel like a redoubt, a place to pull back to when the world outside grew too hostile to navigate. Not a statement of belonging, but a last defensible position. And the world outside was darkening with a speed that preservation could not match. By the mid-1930s, the news from Germany had moved past the point where it could be rationalized or minimized. Jewish businesses seized by decree, families expelled from professions, from neighborhoods, from public life, Rothschild properties in Frankfurt and Vienna placed under direct threat, relatives arriving in London and Paris with what they had been able to carry, having left behind everything they could not. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had fixed on the Rothschild name as the perfect emblem of everything it claimed to be destroying, the face of international Jewish finance, the supposed invisible hand behind governments and wars. Conspiracy theory had been absorbed into official state ideology, and now the full machinery of a modern nation-state, its courts, its police, its bureaucracy, its army, was pointed directly at the kind of accumulated transnational power the Rothschilds had spent 5 generations building. Waddesdon still stood. The parterre was still clipped to precision. The art still caught the light behind glass. From the drive, from any distance, nothing appeared to have changed. But the house on the hill was no longer an answer. It had become a question. What do you do with a castle when the ground beneath it begins to move? The answer was coming, carried on a wind already crossing the channel, already darkening the horizon over a continent that had given the Rothschilds everything, their power, their wealth, their impossible ambition, and was now moving, with terrible deliberateness, to take all of it back. To understand Waddesdon, you have to understand the machine that built it. Most people reach for a simple label. The Rothschilds were bankers, rich ones. That much is true, and that much tells you almost nothing. The engine behind their wealth, how it was assembled, how it moved, what it financed, and what it cost the world to have it operating, was something far more intricate and far more consequential than the word banker suggests. It began with a father and 5 sons. Meyer Amschel Rothschild ran a modest but fiercely ambitious banking house in the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto in the late 18th century. As his sons came of age, he made a decision that would reshape European finance for the next 100 years. He scattered them. Nathan went to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 banking houses that operated not as competitors, but as a single organism with 5 heartbeats. The real innovation was not capital, it was communication. In an era when information traveled at the speed of horses and sailing ships, the Rothschilds built their own courier network. Trusted riders carrying encrypted dispatches between the 5 branches, moving faster than official mail, faster than diplomatic pouches, faster than almost any government could manage. They knew about political crises, military turning points, and market disruptions before nearly anyone else in Europe. And in finance, knowing first is everything. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Nathan Rothschild in London received the news before the British government did. What he did with that advantage has been debated and mythologized ever since. Dramatic accounts of staged trades and manufactured panic circulate to this day. The precise choreography remains contested. What is not contested is the outcome. The Rothschilds emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the dominant private banking family on the continent, with relationships inside every major government and a reputation that made them impossible to ignore or replace. They lent to nations, not through conquest, not through inheritance, through bonds and structured loans, through the machinery of sovereign debt. They became the creditors of empires. When Britain needed to finance a war or lay railway track across a continent, Rothschild capital filled the gap. When France faced crippling war reparations, the family structured the repayments. When newly formed states needed money to stand up armies and ministries and the basic infrastructure of governance, it was frequently a Rothschild office that took the first meeting. This made them indispensable. It also made them a target. Because the network owed allegiance to no single flag, it financed British expansion and French borrowing and Austrian industry with equal fluency. Capital moved wherever the opportunity was sharpest. In peacetime, this was elegant and efficient. In wartime, it became something much harder to explain. Cousins on opposite sides of the same battlefield, family branches simultaneously financing nations that were trying to destroy each other. Profits accumulating from the mechanisms of conflicts that were killing hundreds of thousands of people. Waddesdon sat inside this structure not as a branch office, but as something subtler and in some ways more useful. A polished, neutral space where power could gather away from parliamentary scrutiny and newspaper offices. Conversations that would have looked calculated in a counting house could unfold naturally over a 12-course dinner or a walk through the gardens, with no ledger in sight and no record being kept. A cabinet minister staying for a weekend meant direct access to government thinking. A foreign diplomat on the shooting grounds meant early intelligence about shifting borders or pending trade arrangements. The Prince of Wales in the library with a cigar meant royal favour, which moved through British society like a current, opening doors that money alone could not unlock. The house was never simply one thing. It was a display of taste, a social instrument, and a quietly functioning piece of financial infrastructure. A place where information, trust, and influence circulated as efficiently as capital and considerably more discreetly. The moral weight of all this was rarely examined in public. The Rothschilds funded hospitals and schools and civic water systems. They also financed wars and colonial ventures and extractive policies that enriched certain nations while systematically draining others. The same loans that laid rail lines across Europe helped move raw materials out of Africa and Asia into the hands of imperial powers. The same network that stabilized bond markets concentrated extraordinary power inside a very small, very closed circle of related families who answered, first and finally, to each other. Whether Ferdinand, walking his galleries alone at midnight, wrestled with any of this, whether he found a way to reconcile the Rembrandt on the wall with the battles and bargains that had purchased it, the archives do not say. There are no confessional letters, no private reckoning on paper. What we have instead are the choices, and the house those choices built. The chateau existed because the money machine existed. The money machine functioned because it was fast, transnational, and loyal to no authority above the family itself. Capital moving faster than laws could track it. Power answering first to bloodline and only distantly, when convenient, to public accountability. The chandeliers were real. The gardens were extraordinary. The art was genuine, museum quality, assembled with a collector's eye that could rival any institution in Europe. But beneath every polished surface, the same question waited, quiet, patient, unanswerable. What had all of this beauty cost? And who exactly had been asked to pay? The guests saw perfection. They were meant to. What they were never meant to see was the machinery that produced it. The parallel world running beneath their feet, invisible by design, essential by necessity, and entirely forgotten the moment the last carriage rolled down the drive. A day at Waddesdon began at 4:30 in the morning, sometimes earlier. The house had to be fully operational before a single guest opened their eyes, which meant that by the time the family stirred, the fires were already blazing, the water already hot, the reception rooms already dusted and reset to a standard of perfection that would hold, without visible effort, for the entire day. Kitchen maids lit the coal ranges in darkness, massive iron structures that had to reach temperature well before the first breakfast course could be considered. Scullery maids hauled and scrubbed despite the estate's modern plumbing, because modernity at Waddesdon was a feature of the rooms upstairs. Below stairs, it was still largely muscle and repetition. Housemaids moved through the great reception rooms in near silence, cleaning grates, laying fresh fires, dusting furniture that had been dusted the day before and would be dusted again tomorrow, because the standard was not cleanliness. It was the permanent appearance of having never been touched. The butler governed all of it. At Waddesdon, his authority below stairs was absolute. He managed the footmen, the under-butlers, the hall boys. He controlled the wine cellar, one of the finest private collections in England, and choreographed the service for dinners that might run to 12 courses across 3 hours, each dish timed, each placement exact. He was the invisible director of a production that could never acknowledge it was a production at all. The housekeeper held equivalent dominion over the women. She inspected bedrooms with the thoroughness of a commanding officer, a streak on a mirror, a crease in a pillowcase, dust in a corner that no guest would ever reach. Any of these could mean dismissal, Not because Ferdinand was a cruel employer by the standards of his era, but because the logic of the great house demanded it. Servants were required to be two things simultaneously: invisible and flawless. The demands were inseparable. To remain unseen, your work had to be so precise that no one ever noticed the work at all. The hierarchy below stairs was enforced with the same rigor as the social order above it. Butler and housekeeper at the top, valets and ladies' maids just beneath, those who handled the family's persons and possessions directly, then footmen and housemaids, then kitchen staff, and at the very bottom, scullery maids and hallboys, teenagers mostly, doing the hardest and filthiest labor for wages that reflected exactly how little their comfort mattered to the system. Even meals were stratified. Upper servants ate separately, on better crockery, with conversation permitted. Lower servants ate quickly, spoke sparingly, and returned immediately to their stations. Status followed you everywhere at Waddesdon. There was no room in the building where it did not apply. The bell system was the nervous system of the whole operation. Every major room upstairs had a pull. Springs and wires ran through the walls connecting the two worlds, each bell calibrated to its own tone, so that an experienced servant could identify the calling room by sound alone without moving from their post. When a bell rang, someone moved. Immediately, without hesitation. The family and their guests did not wait. What the servants actually felt about the people they served survives only in fragments. A handful of letters, a few diary entries, occasional notations in household ledgers that suggest personality only at the edges. The picture that emerges is complicated and, in places, surprisingly human. The Rothschilds paid well, better by most accounts than many aristocratic houses of comparable scale. The wages were competitive, the work was exhausting and the hours were long, but the conditions were not considered harsh by the standards of the time. Some staff stayed for decades, which suggests that the alternative, factory work or domestic service in colder households, looked considerably worse. Yet something else ran beneath the relative fairness of the arrangement. The Rothschilds were foreign, Jewish. And the staff understood, consciously or not, that working in a Rothschild house meant being seen by the outside world through the same complicated lens that followed the family everywhere. Some found a particular pride in that association, reflected prestige, second-hand but real. The Prince of Wales had slept in beds they had made. Cabinet ministers had eaten food they had carried. That proximity to power meant something, even from below. Others were more guarded. Letters from former employees described the family as fair but demanding, kind but exacting. The word that surfaces most often in different forms is particular. Everything had to be precisely right. Always. The tolerance for deviation was extremely low. And beneath whatever individual kindness existed ran the structural reality that no amount of good wages could alter. A servant could be dismissed for almost any reason: an error, a complaint, a single clash with a superior, and dismissal meant the simultaneous loss of income, housing, and the reference letter that made future employment possible. Without a good reference, the path forward narrowed to almost nothing. The Rothschilds held that power completely, as all employers in their position did. A generous master is still a master. Kindness extended from a position of total control is still a form of control. These were the people who made Waddesdon real, who turned Ferdinand's performance of belonging into something that could actually be inhabited and believed, who laid the fires and carried the courses and polished the Sèvres porcelain and reset the rooms each morning so that wealth and beauty appeared to exist naturally, as if grandeur was simply a condition of the place, like weather, requiring no human effort to sustain. They were never acknowledged in the official story, never mentioned in the guest memoirs or the society columns, never permitted inside the rooms they spent their lives maintaining. The servants' bells still hang in the basement corridors at Waddesdon, silent now. Part of the museum displays, labelled and interpreted for visitors who pause briefly before moving on to the next gilded room. But once, they rang constantly, and every time they did, someone ran. 1898, the year Ferdinand died. In a French newspaper that same winter, a cartoon appeared, a grotesque figure, rendered with deliberate ugliness, hooked nose, clawed hands, wrapped around a globe stamped with the words, World Finance. The caption beneath it named the figure simply, Rothschild. This was not unusual. It was not even particularly noteworthy by the standards of the era. Caricatures exactly like it ran regularly across Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in England, in France, shifting slightly in their details from one publication to the next. Sometimes the figure clutched money bags, sometimes puppet strings with miniature politicians dangling at the ends, sometimes both simultaneously. But the message beneath the variations never changed. The Rothschilds as something inhuman, something predatory, a sinister hidden force wrapping its hands around the machinery of civilization while the rest of the world went about its business unaware. These were not underground pamphlets passed between extremists in back rooms. They ran in mainstream newspapers, in popular magazines sold on street corners, in political pamphlets distributed in the lobbies of parliaments. The anti-Semitism was casual, normalized, woven into the texture of everyday public life, with the ease of something that had always been there and expected to remain. And yet, the Prince of Wales kept visiting Waddesdon. Queen Victoria had attended Rothschild weddings. The family held titles: Baron Ferdinand, Baron Lionel, Baron Nathaniel, granted by the British Crown and by European monarchs who understood perfectly well who they were dealing with. Rothschild donations funded hospitals, schools, and public parks. Buildings in London and Paris carried the family name in stone. This was the central paradox of the Rothschild position, and it never resolved. They existed simultaneously as essential and despised, welcomed and mocked, powerful beyond almost any private family in Europe, and permanently, structurally exposed. Not despite their success, but because of it. The English aristocracy embodied that contradiction with particular precision. They came to the parties. They admired the collections. They ate the food and shot the birds and lingered over brandy in the library. They turned to Rothschild banks when their own estates needed rescuing, which, for many of them, was more often than they preferred to admit. Some married Rothschild daughters when the dowries were substantial enough to patch the gaps in their finances. Then they went home and made jokes about it. The language was careful, coded, plausibly deniable. Memoirs referred to our Israelite friends. Descriptions of Rothschild houses mentioned Oriental taste. Compliments on the hospitality arrived with quiet qualifiers. Not quite English, of course. Not quite the same as a weekend at Devonshire. The Rothschilds heard all of it. They were too perceptive and too well-informed not to. Ferdinand read the papers. He saw the cartoons. He received letters from relatives on the continent describing things considerably worse than drawing room wit. Street violence, boycotts, new legislation restricting Jewish businesses, political movements built entirely on the targeting of Jewish wealth. His response was the only one he believed could work. He escalated. Build higher, refine further. Make Waddesdon so magnificent, so culturally authoritative, so impossible to dismiss, that the sneering would eventually exhaust itself. If they were going to mock a Jewish banker's chateau, let them do it in front of masterpieces that their own ancestral houses had been forced to sell off to cover debts. Every flawless dinner was an exhibit. Every royal visit was another line of evidence added to the same relentless argument. Look at what we have created. Look how thoroughly we understand your world. Look, without any room for reasonable dispute, how completely we belong. But belonging purchased through sustained perfection carries a particular and brutal cost. Because once perfection becomes the price of admission, it must be maintained without interruption, without exception, without a single visible crack. One scandal, One misstep, one moment of appearing too foreign, too aggressive, too openly Jewish in the wrong room at the wrong moment, and the fragile, conditional acceptance the family had spent decades and fortunes constructing could collapse without warning. The Rothschilds could not afford to be merely impressive. They had to be exceptional in every direction, simultaneously and always. Their houses more refined than anyone else's, their philanthropy more visible, their business dealings more discreet. Their political donations spread carefully across parties so that whoever came to power, someone near the top would carry a sense of obligation to the family. Their marriages kept deliberately within the clan, concentrating wealth and sealing secrets inside a circle small enough to be controlled. And whenever a new caricature appeared, whenever another newspaper ran another grotesque rendering of the family name, the response was always the same disciplined silence. Never complain, never explain, never give the fire more oxygen than it already had. Wear the mask of effortless success so consistently that the mask eventually becomes indistinguishable from the face. It worked. Up to a point, and for a time, it worked. The family held its power. The banking network kept running. The invitations kept arriving. Waddesdon kept its extraordinary sheen. But underneath the performance lived a permanent, unshakable awareness that none of it was guaranteed. That the foundations under the castle were conditional in a way they simply were not for families whose names ran back through the Domesday Book. The English aristocracy could trace certain lineages to knights who had crossed the Channel with William the Conqueror in 1066. The Rothschild story ran through the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto, streets where Jews had been locked in at night, restricted in trade, treated by law as permanent outsiders in the city where they had lived for generations. Ferdinand had been dead less than a generation, but the family carried that memory the way a body carries an old fracture, not always visible, always structural. It shaped every instinct, every defensive reflex, every obsessive need for control and surface perfection. History had taught them, across centuries and without ambiguity, that safety was always temporary, that being simultaneously loved and despised was simply the condition of their existence, that you could own a palace and still not fully own your place in the country surrounding it. The parties came back. They just weren't the same. James de Rothschild reopened the house fully after the armistice. The rooms were scrubbed from attic to cellar. The gardens were coaxed back into their precise geometric order. Staff were rehired, though the numbers never quite recovered to what they had been before 1914. The chandeliers blazed again on Friday evenings. Guests arrived and moved through the reception rooms and sat at the long dining table and said the right things about the art and the food and the extraordinary views from the terrace. On the surface, it looked almost exactly like what Ferdinand had built it to be. Beneath the surface, everyone could feel how thin the floor had become. The interwar years carried a particular and disorienting glamour. Rolls-Royces and Bentleys now swept up the winding drive where carriages had once climbed in stately procession, gleaming machines that made the old conveyances look like relics from another civilization, which they were. Jazz crackled from gramophones in rooms designed for string quartets. Cocktails edged aside the rigid Victorian dinner service, though ceremony still appeared when the occasion demanded it. Women's hemlines rose. American fortunes arrived in Europe buying titles. Social rules that had once seemed immovable were loosening, bending, quietly renegotiating themselves in drawing rooms across the continent. In theory, this should have made the Rothschilds' position easier. If the old barriers were softening, if the aristocratic order was opening itself to new money and new faces, then a family of Jewish bankers with a French chateau in England ought to fit the emerging scene considerably more comfortably than they had fit the rigid hierarchies of the Victorian era. But anti-Semitism was modernizing too, and it was moving faster than the social reforms. In Germany, the Weimar Republic lurched through cycles of inflation, attempted coups, and street violence that left the political center perpetually destabilized. The Nazi Party began as a fringe movement in Munich beer halls in the early 1920s. Easy to dismiss, easy to underestimate, exactly the kind of political pathology that reasonable people convince themselves cannot survive contact with reality. It survived, it grew. By the late 1920s, it had become a serious electoral force, and by 1933, it had consumed the government entirely. Its propaganda had always had a face for Jewish finance. Not a generic face, a specific one. The name Rothschild appeared in Nazi pamphlets and speeches with the regularity of a fixed point, shorthand for everything the movement claimed was corroding Germany from within. Jewish-owned businesses were listed for boycott in newspapers printed by the millions. Directories of Jewish professionals circulated openly. Posters called for Jewish wealth and influence to be dismantled, and the language grew less metaphorical with each passing year. The letters arriving at Waddesdon from relatives in Frankfurt and Vienna traced the escalation in real time. Business restrictions, exclusions from professional organizations, beatings in daylight on public streets, shop windows smashed with organized efficiency, bank accounts frozen under legal pretexts constructed specifically for that purpose. The machinery of the German and then the Austrian state was being turned, deliberately and systematically, against exactly the kind of accumulated Jewish wealth and influence that the Rothschild name had come to represent above all others. James read these letters in the Waddesdon Library, the same room where Ferdinand had once poured brandy for the Prince of Wales, where cabinet ministers had talked quietly about policy after midnight, where the performance of absolute security had been curated with such relentless care. That security now looked, from the vantage of the 1930s, less like a achieved condition and more like a sustained delusion, a very beautiful, very expensive act of wishful thinking that the continent was in the process of violently correcting. England still felt different. British anti-Semitism was real, the closed club doors, the drawing room remarks, the invisible ceilings. But it had not acquired the state-directed, systematized brutality taking shape across the Channel. British Jews faced prejudice and limitation, not organized elimination. The distinction mattered enormously, and Waddesdon began to function accordingly. Family members arrived from France, from Austria, from Germany, cousins whose businesses had been seized or undermined, relatives who had been pushed from their professions or harassed from their homes. The house Ferdinand had built to demonstrate that Rothschilds belonged at the center of European civilization now operated as a refuge for family members being told, loudly and officially, that they did not belong anywhere at all. The gatherings acquired a double life that James maintained with considerable strain. On weekends with British guests, the full performance held. Shooting parties in the morning, formal dinners in the evening, conversation moving easily under the chandeliers. The house presented exactly the face it had always presented. Elegant, generous, impeccably at ease. On quieter weeks, when only family remained, the same rooms held entirely different conversations. Escape routes, deadlines, what to do about the Frankfurt house, whether to evacuate Vienna entirely before the borders tightened further, how to move the most vulnerable relatives to London or Paris before the window closed. The drawing rooms designed for entertainment had become, without anyone formally declaring it, an operations center for a family in the early stages of emergency. The art collection Ferdinand had assembled with such devotion now carried a second meaning that would have horrified him. These were no longer only beautiful objects arranged for aesthetic and social effect. They were condensed, portable wealth, assets that could be moved discreetly, hidden if necessary, or liquidated to fund an escape. Paintings began traveling quietly to London vaults and Paris storerooms. The redistribution was careful and largely invisible. It was also unmistakably the behavior of people preparing for the worst. By the mid-1930s, the worst was no longer a hypothetical. Hitler held power. The Nuremberg laws had stripped German Jews of citizenship and legal standing. The Frankfurt Rothschild Bank, the original house, the ancestral branch where Meyer Amschel had once built the whole enterprise from a small room in the ghetto, was forced to close. The building was seized. Then came November 1938, and the letters and cables arriving at Waddesdon described synagogues burning across Germany and Austria, shop fronts smashed and looted, men dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets while police watched. It was not chaos. It was coordination, state-directed violence wearing the mask of public fury. James convened the family at Waddesdon shortly after. The agenda required no elaboration, survival. How to extract the remaining relatives still inside Germany and Austria. How to protect what assets could still be moved. How to preserve whatever remained of the banking operation while accepting finally that certain branches were already gone. The house on the hill felt simultaneously sheltered and exposed. Geographically, it was far from the immediate violence. Symbolically, it was precisely the kind of target that fascist ideology required. Visible Jewish wealth, built to project influence, impossible to ignore or minimize. The features that had made Waddesdon Ferdinand's greatest triumph now made it an ideal exhibit in every narrative about Jewish power that the Nazi propaganda machine was running at full volume. The gardens were still immaculate, the fountains still played, the pictures still caught the light behind their glass, but it was beauty balanced on ice that everyone could feel thinning beneath their feet. By 1939, the question was no longer whether war was coming, it was what and who would remain when it finally ended. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to last forever, to fix permanence into stone, to prove beyond any reasonable argument that the Rothschilds had earned their place in Europe as surely as any family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. 60 years later, Europe was preparing to destroy itself again. And this time, the Rothschilds were not merely symbols in a cartoon. They were being named as enemies of the state. The lights at Waddesdon would go dark again soon. And this time, no one could say with any confidence that they would ever come back on. Waddesdon Manor, 1945. The war was over. The house was still standing. Neither fact solved the problem James de Rothschild walked back into that autumn. The structure was sound. The art collection had survived intact, the pieces stored in the basement strongrooms emerging from their crates undamaged, Rembrandt and Gainsborough returning to walls that had held them before the world fractured. The grounds could be restored with enough money and labour and time. On paper, Waddesdon had come through the war better than almost anyone had reason to expect. But the world the house had been built to inhabit no longer existed. Before 1939, the justification for maintaining a chateau of this scale had been self-evident. Waddesdon was social infrastructure, a stage for entertaining the powerful, for building and sustaining relationships, for reinforcing the Rothschild position at the centre of British financial and political life. The expense was not simply a cost, it was an investment in influence and access, one that had returned measurable dividends for 60 years. Post-war Britain had no use for that particular investment anymore. The aristocratic system Ferdinand had spent his entire adult life trying to break into was now collapsing under its own accumulated weight. Inheritance taxes and death duties were dismantling landed estates across the country with the efficiency of a second, quieter war. Country houses were being stripped of their contents, abandoned to the weather, demolished outright, or handed over to become schools and hospitals and military colleges. The great weekend house parties, the very social machinery that Waddesdon had been precision-engineered to host, were ending, not because the appetite for them had disappeared, but because almost no one could afford to run them anymore. The Rothschild banking operations had survived the war, but in a form that bore only a partial resemblance to what had existed before. The European network was broken. The continental cousins, who had once formed its human architecture, were dead, or scattered, or rebuilding from conditions of near total loss. The clients who remained were operating inside a new financial order organized around new institutions. The need for a grand English estate to impress them, to signal permanence and cultural authority and effortless belonging, had largely evaporated along with the world that had made those signals meaningful. James had options. Obvious ones. The same ones dozens of families in identical positions were exercising every month. Sell the house. Auction the collection. Find an institution willing to absorb the maintenance burden and walk away with whatever the sale returned. It was the rational calculation. It was what the numbers recommended. It was not what Dorothy de Rothschild could accept. James's wife looked at Waddesdon and saw something her husband's pragmatism could not fully accommodate. Not a beautiful, expensive problem requiring a financial solution, but a document. A record in stone and timber and glass of a specific, irreplaceable moment in European history. Evidence of what a Jewish banking family had built at the height of their power, and evidence in equal measure of how vulnerable that power had always been. The house contained, if you knew how to read it, the full arc of the story, the ambition and the grief, the performance of belonging and the permanent anxiety beneath it, the art and the servants and the cartoons, and the letters arriving from relatives who were running out of time. To sell it felt like tearing out a chapter. To let it decay felt like complicity in its erasure. The solution they moved toward was, for the era, genuinely radical. A formal arrangement with the National Trust, the British organisation established to hold places of historic significance in perpetuity, that would shift Waddesdon from private palace to public heritage site while keeping the family involved in its management and character. The negotiations were detailed and not simple. The family would retain certain rights and a meaningful voice in how the property was run. The core art collection would remain on site and intact. Public access would be offered and carefully managed. The house would be preserved to agreed standards. But agreeing to all of it required admitting something Ferdinand had spent his entire life refusing to admit. That Waddesdon's greatest value now resided in its historical meaning rather than its social utility. That its significance had grown beyond the family that built it. That the surest way to preserve what he had created was to surrender exclusive ownership of it. The thing he had built as the ultimate proof of private belonging would survive by becoming public. James died in 1957, before the transition was fully complete. Dorothy carried it forward. The formal arrangement with the National Trust was finalised, the family remaining involved in management and continuing to add to the collections. Waddesdon acquired a new identity, no longer a working private residence performing aristocratic legitimacy, but a museum and heritage site attempting, at first cautiously, to hold its visual magnificence alongside an honest account of what that magnificence represented. That honesty proved harder than the preservation. For decades after opening to visitors, the official story kept to safe, comfortable ground. Guides spoke about the architecture, the provenance of the paintings, the brilliance of Ferdinand's eye. Visitors moved through rooms hearing about French furniture and Sèvres porcelain and Renaissance portraits. Almost nothing about the lives actually lived within these walls. Nothing about the servants who had made the whole performance possible. Nothing about the anti-Semitism that had shadowed every decision the family made. Nothing about the political storms gathering beyond the windows during the decades the house was most alive. It was beautiful history, curated, elegant, and profoundly incomplete. As new historians and curators took charge over the following decades, that began to change. Archives were opened and properly examined. Boxes from attics and storerooms were worked through systematically. Servant records were read with the attention they deserved. Family correspondence was decoded. Account books were combed for what they revealed about the gap between the world upstairs and the world below. Slowly, a different and considerably more honest picture assembled itself. Ferdinand was not simply a refined collector with impeccable taste. He was a man shaped by childhood illness and catastrophic grief, building a fortress against loss and rejection with the only materials available to him. The weekend parties were not merely scenes of aristocratic leisure. They were calculated performances designed to purchase Over and over, a sense of belonging that remained conditional no matter how many times it was purchased. The servants were not anonymous background figures. They were individuals with names and limited choices and lives structured almost entirely around the needs of people who would never acknowledge how completely those lives made their own possible. The house began, gradually and with some resistance, to tell these stories alongside the ones it had always told. Not to diminish the beauty, but to frame it honestly. Not to erase Ferdinand's achievement, but to ask what it cost, who paid, and whether the accounting had ever been squared. Some visitors wanted only the fairy tale. The gilded rooms, the dazzling dinners, the uncomplicated pleasure of old money looking exactly as old money is supposed to look. Others came wanting the full account. The moral complexity. The human cost. The complete unsanitized story of what wealth at this scale actually requires from everyone drawn into its orbit. Freed at last from its original purpose, Waddesdon could finally become what it had always had the capacity to be. Not a performance. Not a fantasy. Evidence. A physical record of a particular human story, preserved not merely to be admired, but to be understood. The open question, the one the house now poses to every visitor who passes through its gates, is whether people are genuinely willing to hear that story told in full. So the Rothschilds kept walking the line, visible enough to matter, not so visible as to become the perfect target, wealthy enough to command respect, not so ostentatiously wealthy that resentment curdled into something organized, Jewish enough to remain themselves, not so openly, unapologetically Jewish that the Christian establishment found a reason to close its doors entirely. It was a balance that demanded everything. And it was a balance that no one, no family, no fortune, no amount of architectural magnificence could maintain forever. Then the world broke, and the line disappeared entirely. August 1914. The balancing act ended on a Tuesday. When war broke across Europe that summer, the Rothschild banking network, designed over a century to float above national borders, held together by blood ties between capitals, sustained by encrypted letters and trusted couriers moving faster than governments, became, almost overnight, impossible to operate. Nations were done with nuance. Done with the polite fiction that a family could be simultaneously British and Austrian and French and German, that capital could hold dual citizenship, that loyalty could be distributed across a map according to family trees rather than flags. You were one thing now, one country, one uniform. The family had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Cousins who had collaborated across those cities for decades woke up in August 1914 on opposite sides of the same war. The London Rothschilds were British subjects. The Vienna and Frankfurt branches belonged to the Central Powers. The Paris house was French. The same family, the same name, the same blood, now sorted by geography into opposing armies, staring at each other across the most industrialized killing field in human history. There were no good answers to this. There were only choices about which damage to absorb. The London house cut formal communication with Vienna and Frankfurt. Business relationships that had functioned with remarkable smoothness for nearly a century were suspended, then quietly unwound. The network that had been the family's single greatest competitive advantage, faster information, tighter coordination, deeper trust than any institution built around money rather than blood, turned suddenly into a liability. Each branch now had to demonstrate loyalty to its own government, and the most efficient way to do that was to behave as though the other branches did not exist. The family that had floated above nations for 100 years was being forced at last to choose one. And beneath the rupture of the banking network, something quieter and more personal was breaking. War arrived at Waddesdon, not in the form of shells or soldiers, but carried by the men who left and did not come back. The staff thinned with brutal speed. Footmen enlisted. Hall boys signed their names at recruiting offices and boarded trains for the coast. The under-butler, the second footman, 3 of the stable hands. Gardeners who had kept Ferdinand's legendary parterres in their precise geometric order traded their shears for rifles and went to France. Some returned with wounds, some returned in coffins, some did not return at all. Their names were carved into the estate's war memorial after the fighting ended, a simple stone. The list ordered alphabetically, without distinction between servant and family. In death, for once, the hierarchy held its tongue. James de Rothschild, who had inherited Waddesdon from his mother Alice, enlisted himself despite being under no obligation to do so. He served. He was wounded. He went back. While he was away, the chateau sat mostly empty, a reduced skeleton staff keeping the walls alive through basic maintenance, lighting fires in cold rooms, performing the minimum rituals of preservation for a house waiting for a world that would not fully return. The damage to the wider Rothschild architecture was far worse than anything Buckinghamshire absorbed directly. The Vienna branch, once among the most formidable in the network, was devastated by the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Properties seized, assets frozen or erased. The Frankfurt house faced equivalent pressure inside a Germany that had lost the war and was now looking, with increasing desperation, for someone to blame for it. What had taken 5 generations and 100 years to assemble fractured along national lines that had barely existed when the system was first conceived. And underneath the wreckage lay a realization that no amount of banking sophistication could soften. Money could not insulate anyone from industrialized slaughter. The Rothschilds had financed railways and sovereign debts and the infrastructure of modern states. They had built palaces and assembled art collections that rivaled public institutions. They had entertained the heirs to thrones in rooms decorated with gold. None of it, not a single gilded ceiling, not a single royal visit, not a single masterwork hanging in perfect light, mattered to a machine gun or a high explosive shell. When millions of men were mobilized to kill and be killed on an industrial scale, no chateau on a Buckinghamshire hill could guarantee that the boys who polished its silver would survive the season. Ferdinand's central argument, that success could purchase safety, that perfection could hold chaos at a sufficient distance, lay exposed as the wish it had always been. You could build the most magnificent house in England, fill it with beauty and carefully chosen guests, prove endlessly that you had taste and standing and an unassailable claim to belong. And then war arrived, and the young men who had kept the whole illusion running died in French mud. And all that architecture, all that precision, all that relentless performance revealed precisely how little any of it could control when the world decided to break. The moral weight of the family's position became harder to deflect as the years of fighting accumulated. The Rothschilds had helped issue bonds funding the war effort on multiple sides: British war loans, French government borrowing, post-war reconstruction financing. They earned fees from the mechanisms of a conflict that was simultaneously killing people they knew personally. They were not unique in this. Every major bank in Europe did the same, profiting from the financial architecture of mass destruction while calling it patriotic service. The difference was the name. When Christian-owned banks earned money from war finance, the transaction was framed as national duty. When the Rothschilds did the same, anti-Semitic propagandists reframed it as evidence of conspiracy, Jewish financiers pulling strings, engineering Christian bloodshed for private gain. The accusations were grotesque distortions. They were also impossible to fully refute in public without amplifying them. So the family absorbed them in silence, as it had absorbed so much else. And the caricatures grew sharper, and the pamphlets grew wilder, and the name that had once signified financial mastery began, in certain quarters, to signify something darker and more dangerous. When James came home to Waddesdon after 1918, the house was structurally intact. The collections were in place, the gardens could be restored, but the atmosphere had shifted in ways that could not be undone by pruning or polish. The parties resumed, the weekends refilled, the chandeliers blazed on schedule. Yet something fundamental had drained out of the rooms. The war memorial in the grounds made it impossible to ignore. A quiet, permanent stone, names carved in alphabetical order, marking the young men who had laid fires and served wine and trimmed hedges and kept the beautiful illusion operational, and who had then gone to France and not come back. Their names in stone were the most honest thing on the estate. Fixed, unarguable. Permanent in a way that Ferdinand's entire social project had never quite managed to be. The house had been built to mean safety. The chaos had come anyway. And beyond the horizon, gathering weight and speed with every passing year, something worse was already forming. Waddesdon Manor, the early 1920s.